In this video, I will use the example of international banking giant HSBC and how it used its advertising power to silence reporting in 3 UK newspapers: The Telegraph, Guardian and Sunday Times. All sources for this video you'll find in the description box below. The first example comes from Peter Oborne, former chief political commentator at The Telegraph, who resigned from his job in 2015 after he was censored from writing about HSBC because it was one of the paper's major corporate advertisers. Late in 2014, Peter set to work on a story about HSBC. Well-known British Muslims had received letters out of the blue from HSBC informing them that their accounts had been closed. When Peter submitted it for publication on the Telegraph website, he was at first told there would be no problem. When it was not published, he made inquiries. He was fobbed off with excuses, then told there was a legal problem. When he asked the legal department, the lawyers were unaware of any difficulty. When he pushed the point, an executive took him aside and said, "There's a bit of an issue with HSBC." Eventually he gave up in despair and offered the article to Open Democracy. A link to his article is in the description box below. He researched the newspaper's coverage of HSBC. He learned that Harry Wilson, the banking correspondent of The Telegraph, had published an online story about HSBC based on a report from a Hong Kong analyst who had claimed there was a black hole in the HSBC accounts. The story was swiftly removed from the Telegraph website, even though there were no legal problems. When he asked HSBC whether the bank had complained about Wilson's article or played any role in the decision to remove it, the bank declined to comment. Then, on 4th of November 2014, a number of papers reported a blow to HSBC profits as the bank set aside more than £1 billion for customer compensation and an investigation into the rigging of currency markets. This story was the city splash in the Times, Guardian and Mail, making a page lead in the Independent. Peter inspected the Telegraph coverage. It generated 5 paragraphs in total on page 5 of the business section. Peter then met with Murdoch McLennan, the executive chief of the Telegraph at that time, and Murdoch agreed that advertising was allowed to affect editorial, but was unapologetic, saying that, and I quote, "it was not as bad as all that," end quote, and adding that there was a long history of this sort of thing at the Telegraph. The second example I want to discuss involves HSBC fraud totaling an estimated £1 billion regarding the bank's ability to prey on unsuspecting British shoppers, which has been systematically covered up by much of the UK media. This is all according to former debt recovery specialist and whistleblower Nicholas Wilson. HSBC has been integrally involved in a fraudulent scheme to illegally overcharge British shoppers in arrears for debt on store cards at leading British high street retailers. Without knowing, hundreds of thousands of Britons have been defrauded of a total of £1 billion worth of money. Wilson says, and I quote, "I handled John Lewis's debt collection for over 20 years and negotiated my firm's contract with HSBC/HFC. The illegal arrangement was between the solicitors and the bank, and I told them at the very first meeting it was illegal," end quote, and that was in 2003. By 2006, Wilson could no longer stomach the fraudulent fees that were being applied to accounts handled by HSBC for retailers like John Lewis and many others. As many as 600,000 people, he estimates, were being defrauded. He went to the Law Society and blew the whistle. Wilson was soon after made redundant. The Law Society oversaw a mediation process between Wilson and HSBC, in which the Society eventually concluded that the solicitors had no right to charge consumers the excess fees. Still, why would there be such a huge degree of censorship on Wilson's story on HSBC fraud, but abundant coverage of the HSBC Swiss bank tax evasion scandal? The scandal points out, according to Joe Benjamin, a campaigner for Move Your Money UK, is not related to UK crimes or issues that might threaten HSBC's continued operation in the UK. Given that HSBC has subsidiaries in 556 tax havens around the world, he said, the bank can deal with a tax avoidance scandal in one of these jurisdictions and continue relatively unscathed. But there's another issue, which relates to the scale of such fraud in the UK and its contribution to economic growth. London, even more than Wall Street, is the world's financial capital, harbouring most of the global economy's international transactions and therefore holding 400% more money than Britain's entire GDP. A significant quantity of this money, many hundreds of billions of pounds worth, is from the criminal economy and laundered through UK banks and their subsidiaries. The exposure of HSBC's fraud in Britain could fundamentally jeopardise both the bank's domestic and US operations. The Guardian, in contrast, has loudly and triumphantly congratulated itself for reporting on the HSBC Swiss bank scandal, despite the bank putting its advertising relationship with the newspaper on pause. Yet the newspaper has refused to cover Wilson's story exposing HSBC fraud in Britain. Why? During the Treasury Select Committee meeting on 15th of February 2015, HSBC CEO at that time, Stuart Gulliver, told the committee that The Guardian was the largest recipient of HSBC advertising revenue of all digital news outlets. According to The Guardian Media Group's annual financial review for 2014, its American website, Guardian US, delivered record online traffic in the form of over 20 million unique monthly views, representing year-on-year growth of 12%. User growth permitted a dramatic increase in advertising revenues. Revenues from US operations more than doubled on the previous 12-month period, reflecting advertising demand and sponsorship deals with partners such as HSBC, Netflix and Airbnb. The Guardian links with HSBC go beyond mere advertising. Much has been made of the fact that the newspaper is owned and run by the Scott Trust. However, The Guardian is not owned by a trust at all. In 2008, the trust was replaced with a limited company that was accordingly renamed the Scott Trust Limited, though not a trust at all, but simply a profit-making company. Interestingly, in 2014/2015, the chair of the Scott Trust Limited board was Dame Liz Forgan, and she was deputy chair of the board of the British Museum, where she was appointed a trustee in 2008. According to the minutes of a British Museum board meeting that year, the board approved a bank mandate to open an HSBC account that would facilitate HSBC being a sponsor of the museum activities. Forgan is also patron of St Giles Trust, which since 2013 has been sponsored by HSBC as part of its 3-year opportunity partnership. This may just be a coincidence, but either way, the fact is that the chair of the company during that time, which owns The Guardian, the biggest recipient of HSBC digital advertising revenue, was involved in facilitating HSBC's contributions to 2 institutions. The third example is with the Sunday Times. Investigative journalist Naviz Ahmed reported that the Sunday Times had planned a big expose of the HSBC consumer credit fraud. The story was inexplicably dropped at the last minute. Ahmed wrote in 2015, and I quote, "HSBC happens to be the main sponsor of a series of Sunday Times league tables, published for Fast Track 100 Limited, a news networking events company. The bank is the title sponsor of the Sunday Times HSBC Top Track 100, has been title sponsor of the Sunday Times HSBC International Track 200 for all 6 years, and was previously title sponsor of the Sunday Times Top Track 250 for 7 years, end quote. And to back that up, Wilson says on his website that, and I quote, "Today it has been widely reported that the Sunday Times has published, in an unprecedented leak, the list of David Cameron's resignation honours. What is very significant about the Sunday Times article is what it does not say. Camilla Cavendish used to be associate editor of the Sunday Times. She is a contemporary of Cameron's at Oxford, on the same course as him, at the same college. She is also a colleague at Pearson plc of previous HSBC director and current BBC Trust chair Ronna Fairhead. Last year before the election, Sunday Times Home Affairs correspondent Tom Harper was investigating the HSBC fraud story and Cameron's involvement in covering it up. The intention was to publish an article before the election. I worked with Tom Harper for 4 to 6 weeks on the story. During that period, Camilla Cavendish attended a meeting with Cameron at his country residence, Chequers. The story was dropped, and I was told by Harper on the day before publication was due, only because I asked. No explanation was given," end quote. Here is just an example of one company influencing 3 UK newspapers via its financial clout through advertising. The Wilson story was finally covered by The Guardian, but only after he won the court case in 2017 and 13 years later. Although the Financial Conduct Authority said that 6,700 people had been fraudulently billed and only £4 million needed to be compensated. Advertisers are not always so shy about their activities. Some, like American Express, pulling ads from Sky News or a right-wing interview, are said out loud. However, I didn't feel the need to cover those kind of stories, as no cover-up went on, and so I feel the advertiser can do as he pleases. I also didn't cover the current social media crackdown on predominantly right-wing views, as I think to a large extent they're quite open about it too, although I think both are wrong. Free speech is free speech. You can't choose that only opinions you hate should be restricted. What I hope to show is that the influence of advertisers is much deeper and more subtle. We only know about them from whistleblowers or when people of high moral fibre just quit their jobs and tell all. I hope this video served as some introduction as to how the media is not as free as it claims to be. Even if the media outlet is well-meaning and wants to report the facts, in a free market economy, it must make a profit, and with that comes inherent limitations, as long as they rely on advertisements. If you like this video, please give a like and a subscribe, and in the next video, I'll talk about another propaganda filter, sourcing.